Okay. So this panel, we have two speakers. We have Anne Stoller and Stathis Gurgaris. Anne's going to tell us about interior frontiers, and then Stathis will tell us about borders.
So,
It's going to be a difference.
what? There better be a difference, right? Can you hear me? Am I close enough? Okay, interior frontiers. As political concept, diagnostic, and positif. We are in a moment for which we should have been prepared, of distinctions and fears to which we might have been more attentive, even as those divisive cuts through our social, political, and affective landscapes seem to have erupted rather than shift, as I think they have, as tectonic plates, not readily visible with the tools we bring to them, not registered by the metrics we have used to measure duress, privations, and anxieties that are so durable that they are ill-perceived, and that might need us to garner other sensibilities and sonics askew to our shared radars. I'm worried, as so many of us are, that this is a moment in which the political categories and concepts to which we've adhered may now seem inadequate or wholly inoperative. So this is what I wrote before coming yesterday. But I'm no longer sure that this is the case. What I find so extraordinary and so moving about our collective venture here, inspired by Etienne, is how in this coming together, he has gifted us the possibility to think with him in an active voice about possibilities of what politics could and should be, and to treat critique not as ideology, but as practice that makes us think, work, and act differently and better. What I want to talk about today are interior frontiers, as in a somewhat different vein than some of the wonderful contributions that have preceded me. It is not, to my mind, part of the repertoire of Etienne's offerings of what one might strive for, but a concept with a more equivocal history, one that reaches to what Ralph Ellison would call, I quote, the lower frequencies of human experience, and indeed offer an alert that it might actually get in our way. And two, it's a more personal voyage, a thinking with Etienne, less in the more formal manner we've set out in the Political Concepts Collective, one that is a bit closer for me to the bone. It's a political concept that's grabbed me since Etienne first reanimated it some 25 years ago, a political concept and an insight he borrowed from the early 19th century philosopher Johann Fichte's 13th lecture in his addresses to the German nation delivered in 1808. It may have come from Fichte, but it is one with which Etienne has emblazoned his own astutely considered reflections and extensions. That political concept in English goes by the term interior frontier, in French by frontière intérieure, a gloss of the German, innere Grenzen, sometimes rendered in English as interior border or boundary as well. Both elements of the concept, the modifying adjective interior and the border as a mobile noun, gain their force precisely from the polyvalence and from the multiple variant references to which they call attention. The task, then, is not to seek the best rendition, which would wholly miss the point, but rather to explore and develop a political analytic and a form of social inquiry that is as mobile as the concept and the reality of the intimately implicated politics to which it refers. That not only takes on its ambiguities and its sites of intangibility, but treats them as key critical features of the political and epistemic insights it affords. In so doing, I want to distinguish Fichte's use of the term Etienne's amplifications, and my own sense of its closings and openings. As a political concept, again, diagnostic and dispositif. It is not only, I would argue, a commanding concept in the massive corpus of Etienne's texts over some 30 years, but even prior to his use of the term, its conceptual breadth, its analytic matrix provides an orienting guide to the issues on which he has pressed, the subversions on which he's insisted by the different accents he gives to it, not least in wreaking intentional havoc with interiors and exteriors. The political predicaments on which he focused, the political logics he repeatedly has sought and continues to make more legible for us. Staying close to his text between 1985 and 2015 is not merely an act of homage. I use them to track the purchase that the concept's ambiguity yields and the seemingly disparate domains that its filiations might productively make hard to untangle. Since I first touched on Interior Frontiers in 1991, it's been a thickly braided thread, tying my earlier archival work on the making of racial distinctions and their invisible coordinates in colonial formations, to more recent preoccupations with how the assessment of sentiment, remorse in particular, figures in the racialized recesses of the law today. As my title suggests, I take the term to mark a political concept as part of our diffracted histories of the present, as a dispositif, both an apparatus and a network, a réseau, in Foucault's sense, of racialized states, and a diagnostic of where and how acute and anxious sites of over-identification and emotively charged and violent contestation emerge, of conditions that solicit and depend on nurturing fiercely held dispositions, what I call elsewhere le goût de race et le dégoût de l'autre, the taste of race and the distaste for others, which they animate and on which they call. For how these interior frontiers are positioned and where one falls vis-a-vis their gated space, for those granted inclusion as opposed to those for whom those bonded borders are undesirable or made hard to decipher, marks some of the most consequential and violently guarded racial fault lines in our world today. So I pursue several tasks to underscore the poignantly pressing and politically critical ways in which the concept of an interior frontier does away with, as Etienne rightly has called, the state fiction, that a border is a line, bridges and makes sense of plural interior borders on multiple scales, which is really important for me, on multiple scales of person and polity, and blurs the distinction between political rationalities and the affective economy in which they're lodged. Interior frontiers hover in the gray zone that makes the personal political, fortifying the tenuous attachments that follow, that allow a me, in the sense of being part of a we, as it distinguishes we and they, us and them. Conceptually and concretely, an interior frontier defines the contours of a protective and precarious threshold, more than a line. Instead of a border as a line, we might think instead of thick and narrow corridors, replete with comportments, sensibilities, sensory aversions, dress and speech, ill-perceived and unarticulated, but not ill-defined, where the standards of normalization and critique are at war and on the line, perhaps not unlike that to which Raymond Williams once sought to turn our collective attention, namely to those inchoate, unfinished structures of feeling, not a term I really love, but I love the sense of what he's after, namely at that what he calls the very edge of semantic availability, where feeling, expressed as fear, humiliation, threat, longing, or shame, is not opposed to political thought, but indexical of thought and fundamental to it, not fixed in ideology, but in solution and in charged political tension. For some, a border is to be crossed. For others, it is, as Etienne notes, where one resides. So let's start with Fichte, who developed the concept of interior frontier in a very specific context as a call to the defeated German nation on the brink of ruination following the Napoleonic Wars. For Fichte, it was a call to take up moral arms rather than the militarized deadly weapons of war. Central to his visionary roadmap, it was to be a unifying concept, a hopeful intervention, and indeed, in Etienne's account, a radical one. I should say at the start that my summation and reading did not address the bold proposals and bid Fichte made for a German supremacy through universal public education. My account is not as generous as Etienne's, nor as appreciative or sanguine about the political possibilities such attention to interior frontiers may yield. If in Fichte's hands an interior frontier was a fortifying moral barricade against the erosion of the nation and the self, I've been more struck by its dark underside, by the raw and visceral and passionately protected distinctions it has the potential to activate and install. I think here of racism's intimate and surreptitious dwellings, bodily, affective, and in the flesh. Let me just quote one place where the term figures centrally in Fichte's writing, the famous 13th address to the German nation, I quote, and I do it very quickly. The first, I quote, the first original and truly natural boundaries of states are beyond doubt their Innergrenzen, their internal frontiers. Those who speak the same language are immediately and naturally linked by the very, please underscore this, the multitude of invisible bonds to each other. Prior to any human artifice, they understand each other and are capable of continuously developing their understanding. They belong together and are naturally one and indivisible whole. Such a whole cannot desire to absorb or mix with, interbreed with, mitvermation, excuse my German, I don't have any, another of a different heritage and language without at least initially confusing themselves and without profoundly disturbing the regular development of their culture. The outer demarcation of residence only follows as a consequence of this interior frontier, unquote. I'll not speak to the salvation sought in this multitude of invisible bonds just yet, nor to Fichte's sense that what constitutes a people is not territory, but language and linguistic origin. But Etienne disrupts such a facile reading to highlight Fichte's two bold displacements, lauding his refusal to reckon descent through blood, and Fichte's rejection of language as an historical artifact, but rather to show how the very living of a language, how it is lived, forges an ethical attitude and reciprocal belonging. Etienne's interpretation of Fichte's interior border rests on its future possibility, as he puts it, of a new history. And it is here where the interior border shifts its locus and finds, in Etienne's words, its most profound import. Here where language, as the, quote, essence of the social bond, speaks in the first person, unquote, and not least in a specifically moral education where, quote, an individual's interiorization of the patriotic community, unquote, is animated and launched. But there's nothing inherently positive about such attachments. On the contrary, Etienne halts here before the paradox that the internal border produces, entailing both division and unity, closure and opening. For the border, I quote, is no longer marking territorial spaces, but a newly constituted time of projection in the future. Warily, Etienne notes that the new internal borders emerge for Fichte in an educational system that, I quote, suppresses the differences between conditions, unquote, thus creating another, quote, critical kind of internal border. That's quoting Etienne. And then, on a more somber, prescient note, Etienne asks, quote, whether the whole education process does not tend to substitute for the historical division of social conditions another division between the good and the wicked, an invisible border between two species of men, unquote. Here, Homo academicus looms as Homo hierarchus in relief and portends one powerful installment of unequally valued humankinds. So interior borders bear equivocal potentialities for marking restrictive exclusions and new divisions, hierarchies of worth, and privileged moral affiliation. In Etienne's reanimation of the concept, the implications of Fichte's call might have been his inspiration, but his own insights exceed the prompt that Fichte provided by the very context, conjunctures he chooses for its current applications. What Etienne brings to what he called this astonishing concept focuses on and fleshes out a more copious, richly ambiguous place, one dovetailing with his own vocabulary in the mid-1980s, where he was already challenging what constituted the interior and the exterior, and the state's investment in casting the interior differentials of rights to the exterior frontiers. Thus, in 1984, he called out immigration as an internal colonization in Le Sujet aux Citoyens. And a year later marked, I quote, la frontière politique intérieure, with no reference then to Fichte, as that which prescribed the inequities between citizen and subject. The conceptualization, rather than the concept itself, permeates Etienne's analytics, as I have said, avant le lettre, of exigent examination of Fichte's use of the term. In 1988, in Racism as Universalism, he signals less as endorsement than a dis-ease, noting that the radicality, in Etienne's words, of Fichte's address does not protect him against the more than ambiguous political implications of his doctrine. For if racism is understood not as an additive or complement to nationalism, but its product and fundamental infrastructural support, then the concept of interior frontier opens to another balance, one dependent on institutionalized inequalities and discriminations that internally divide not only subject and citizen, but each among and within themselves. Double consciousness in such a political frame may not only be the fate, as Du Bois argued, of those who are explicitly raced, but of those who bear racism's unmarked signs, whiteness, as they maneuver themselves through a politics of disregard that never can obliterate the disquieting discomforts that come with investing in those distinctions. Etienne first sent me his essay on Fichte et les frontières intérieures in the fall of 1991. I still have the note. It was published a year later, and it hit like a bolt of recognition, steeped as I was in what constituted the invisible bonds of white colonial privilege, the moral distinctions and privileged cultural competencies that European colonials awkwardly relegated to themselves. Not only did the concept of an interior frontier capture the sort of amorphous moral criteria used to distinguish which natives could be accorded European equivalents in a court of law, it was a fashioned and achieved labor that infused child-rearing, schooling, domestic architecture, and Dutch proficiency criteria deployed to bar those who did not display and could not adequately demonstrate that they felt adequately at home in a European milieu. What's more, Fichte's very emphasis in describing this intangible belonging, the term he used, les liens invisibles, was the very same phrase used in Dutch and French colonial documents to make the racial cut, to assert who could be accorded the privileges of a white European status and who could not. But what most attracted me to the term was the way in which it pointed to a dispositional way of being in the world, an interior landscape of personhood condemned. And thus French authorities could condemn a mixed-blood Métis boy in Indochine in the 1870s to be tried more severely in a native rather than European court of law, despite having a European father, because he did not demonstrate the sort of interiority, the fact that he was the kind of person. Now, the issue here was the person, not the deed, that could show his love of patrie. He was illiterate, morally suspect, and knew only a few French words. It is in this 1990 text that Etienne most clearly delineates the interior frontier's paradoxical nature, treating it, as he put it, as a symptom. He underscored less Fichte's utopian vision than what he called the condensation of contradictions, describing it both as a site of enclosure and contact, both obstacle and opening. We might specify the list of contradictions further as sites of arrest and attenuated movement, of transgression and unequal exchange. But it is when Etienne returns to the adjective internal or interior in a paper delivered 3 years later where he calls on the recently published work of the psychiatrist André Green, that internal moves analytically again and takes on a different signification. Here, Etienne puts more demands on other polysemic features of the internal with a slight shift of political grammar. Interior slides from the adjective to an active verb, a set of practices and affective attachments imposed upon and embraced by those who those precariously perched or comfortably settled on this toxic frontier. What becomes more of issue is what gets internalized and interiorized in citizens, subjects, and the stateless, in part managed by institutions of the state. With this semiotic shift, the internal border is rendered differently with a different emphasis, equally shaped by and defined through the dispositions and habits of those who savor and depend on its delineations, and by those who are relegated to its outside and on whom it bears. The border is not the same for the two, Etienne tells us. The interiorities it instills are not as well. We might think here again of a dispositif as a dense transfer point of power in Foucault's sense. It is in this liminal zone, in the very making of an interior frontier, where what Judith refers to as senses of the subject, both the invested placements and imposed displacements, are so tendaciously contested and forged. But perhaps as much insight into the multiple ambiguous valences Etienne finds in the concept and the broadened analytic space it occupies for him might be found in an earlier text on citizenship from 1988 and nationality, which I think might be his first, I'm not sure, his first loose use of it. In his discussion of citizenship is based on a principle of exclusion, he asked whether citizenship is not only a right, something we referred to yesterday, but a status. And thus he uses the term frontière intérieure of citizenship as not hard and fixed, but present by degrees. As he reminds us, modern citizenship might seem to abolish all forms of exclusion, but we find instead that the frontier is interiorized, not because certain populations are inherently different, but because the state treats certain members of its populations differently, and especially those antérieurs to the national community. The more striking move that Etienne makes comes several years later, where the interior frontier is not only the palimpsest of two subsequent tests, what is a text, what is a border, and the borders of Europe, which Stathis may be discussing, both delivered in 1993 and published in La Grande Masse in 1997, but where he begins to explore a psychic space that Fichte would only suggest, drawing again on the psychiatrist Green's astute observation on the concept of la limite, the border, in his book La Folie Privée. In Green's rendition, a border is, I quote, a line of demarcation that is never a line, but I quote, a vast territory where no precise division allows for the separation between what is, in his case, madness, and what is not. Two, he moves us to an internal landscape that magnifies hate and fear. And three, most remarkably, he distinguishes between, I quote, having a border and being one. As Green wrote, one can be a citizen or stateless, but it is difficult to imagine that one is a frontier. It is this powerful formulation to which Etienne most assiduously attends, asking whether it is in just such a condition, in what Green calls a no man's land, that so many people live, quote, that affect up close their being, inasmuch as it, they, is neither this nor that. And it is here that Etienne asks whether it is not only on the margins of society, that is in the banlieue and the marshes and the outskirts, where the frontier is recognized and drawn, but that I quote, the parties, the nations, the regions, that we have habitually come to consider as having borders themselves are ones. In the essay Frontiers of Empire, that's me. Well, it's actually Etienne too, so If I have time, I'll go there. Etienne returns us to what he called Fichte's decisive formulation, but once again with a further amendment to frontière intérieure, appending in parentheses, he probably doesn't even remember this, appending in parentheses, two alternative formulations that enlarge, complement, and offer yet another inflection on the initial Fichtean one. The first is frontière intériorisée, so interiorized frontiers, now familiar to us. But the second is frontière pour l'intériorité, for interiority, which in French and English is a really awkward phrase, right? Whether these are variants or reformulations is not altogether clear. What work might these supplemental recastings of the concepts do that need these two distinct, if they actually are, further qualifications? The first turns us to how persons in a polity construe these treasured delineations as part of themselves. But in the second, frontiers for interiority, the for, suggests another charge, an interiority that is a sense of one's worth and invokes the boundary border to stabilize, provide legitimacy to the small advantages one might otherwise not have the means and capacity to garner. Here, the imagined protective border joins the cultivation of a body politic, as Foucault might call it, secured through a cultivation of the self. Such symbolic differences, as Etienne refers to them, are not in the service of a flourishing communal well-being, as Foucault studied them in ancient Greece, because that's how we keep thinking and talk about this cultivation of the self, but in a circumscribed civility, whose participation for some humankinds is categorically foreclosed. In such a regime of truth, what Etienne will now call, referred to earlier, the ultra-subjective forms of violence are nourished. In these corridors of la limite, the border and its, quote, extreme forms of expression. But they are not of the making of diminished souls, those of weakened will alone. They are, as he describes in his Temps Moderne article of 1996, inscribed, and I quote, the naturalization of domination, a formula he attributes to the combined lexicon of Foucault and Marx. One might think here with Edward Said's development of the concept of an imaginative geography that productively and emotionally bifurcates what is deemed a threat, in his case Islam, and what is not. A formulation of a space and a method, as he put it, I quote Said, of controlling what seems to be a threat to some established view of things. I would call this not just an imaginative geography, but an affective one that distributes what I can care about, what falls outside the purview of my morally founded concerns. And a year later, in World Borders, Political Borders, the border, la limite, now is renamed by Etienne, I quote, the holy, non-democratic condition of democratic institutions, unquote, with a key displacement underscored. It is accepted, sanctified, and interiorized and transported from the exterior to, I quote, the middle of political space. Whatever disagreements there might be between Etienne and Poulantzas, the resonance with the latter's 1978 treatment of the internal enemy is hard to miss, where the, quote, frontiers of the national space, in Poulantzas' words, are internalized at, I quote, the heart of that space itself. Note here, the making of interior frontiers can never be just a state project and a manipulation alone. They emerge at, I quote, the heart of civic space, permeate who can walk which streets without feeling out of place, narrowing down the spaces in which one can feel at home. In U.S. racecraft, as the Fields put it, it shapes the places where one is rendered unsafe. Loic Wacquant nails it further, arguing that in the U.S., race is a civic felony. Back to Etienne, and fast forward to 2010. In Civic Universalism and its internal exclusions, the lathe of the concept is turned once again to ask whether, I quote, the marks of belonging that are retrieved in the individual and interiorized by him is a counter effect. I would call it a counterfeit communion, where the consequences of contradicting the norm, that is by deviation or destruction, are most viscerally played out. In turning from Fichte to Foucault, what is imagined to be the interiorized border between the criminal and the deviant, between the citizen and the internal enemy, is a labile space where the potential criminal is deemed deviant, something we know from Foucault's early lectures, mobilizing a surveillance and security regime as a protective command, and with a legitimated mandate, as Foucault would put it in his 1976 lectures, to defend society against itself. One last move along these interior and interiorized frontiers is worth our while. It emerges in Green's extraordinary text, The Concept of the Border, La Limite, where he asks, what is the limit of a person? And speaks, to my mind, directly to the intrusions and transgressions that racialized relations inflict on those subsumed by them, by those on whom they are imposed, and by those who invoke them. Green does not call upon Fanon or Du Bois, but his sensibility is not that different from what Fanon saw as the psychic scars of a racial colonial machine burned into the future of Europe and into the permeable membrane that is the flesh. When we imagine the limit of a person, Green writes, it is the envelope of the skin, which immediately comes to mind. But no, he says, he reminds us the skin is discontinuous and porous. The tissue of flesh is interrupted by other tissues. It's full of holes, il est troué. That act as gates, or better as customs inspectors. He writes, eyes, gaze, ears, nose, mouth, anus, genitalia. I would write eyes, the suspicious gaze, ears, unwelcome music as noise, irritant, cooking smells, nose, cooking smells rendered repugnant. At issue for Green are two problems: the consistency and the structure of the border, and the circulation in and out of its gates. But what are the frontiers of my psyche, he asks, I quote. There are different sorts of frontiers, those without circulation across them, or osmotic membranes that permit communication with a selection among them, which should be introduced or held exterior in the case of perturbation, and more vigorously rejected if there is a need. In the case of danger, the osmotic borders can enlarge to relieve what is inside, inopportune, troubling excitations. But other measures are possible, such as a rigidification of the line, a sort of scleriosis, or even a jamming of the frontier, which creates in the place of a fragile demarcation, rather a no man's land. To be a frontier is to identify one as a moving frontier to which one submits, more than one to which that one commands. And worse, to be a border line implies that a border protects oneself from crossing over, or from being crossed over, he writes, from being invaded and thus becoming a moving border. This in turn implies a loss of distinction between space and time, unquote. I'm struck by this passage on many accounts. I'm almost finished. Not only because it revamps the work that this making of an interior border does, it works not on a body, but through it. Bodily exposures are part and parcel of the interior frontier as a dispositif. One might think here with Jacques Rancière, here about le partage du sensible, right? Of that division of the senses, that distribution of the senses, or of Judas' invocation again of the senses of the subject, partitions, impingements, willfully, unwillfully imposed, reminding us that there are no selves fully subsumed or hermetically sealed. If Green leans on the metaphor of territorial borders to make his case, he does so to emphasize permeabilities, invasions, contaminations, fissures, penetrations to which one has no ready exit and cannot be immune. It's obviously not only in our dire present moment when interior frontiers are fortifying at the expense of others, but they are doing so on a new scale, a racial emporium that both exceeds nation states as it instills more trenchant xenophobia. At issue is what forms of sociality, which has sort of been our project for the last day and a half, right, might produce common refuge rather than anxious and noxious retrenchment. For no matter how well we understand the conceptual matrix in which these internal and internalized distinctions are drawn, we are still left to learn more about their vernacular making in things, feelings, infrastructural arrangements, the tangible, intangible ways in which these invisible borders and bonds are drawn, and our capacity to identify them. The colloquial form that these battles take are deceptively straightforward. There is a we who no longer feel comfortable and feel safely at home. So those of us who sort of read the French press, nous sommes plus chez nous. We're no longer at home. We're no longer in our place. Heard on the lips of more than Front National supporters. I quote again, we are where we belong and at home. Nous sommes chez nous, the response of a defiant citizenry born in North Africa and in France. Home is invoked, or rather erupts again with pas de jungle chez nous. We don't want the Calais chez nous. We don't want the jungle, the illicit, the squatter settlements. And we don't welcome refugees here, chez nous. And then finally, and not least, we find it reverberating among an otherwise well-mannered populace in small towns in the Netherlands, in the halls of Ohio high schools, on the wrestling team of a prestigious New York university, Columbia, and a self-declared poorly endowed progressive one, the New School, who felt licensed and emboldened to shout, as the French put it, decomplexified, no complex about it, go home where you belong. Home figures again and again, as Green and Etienne note, for those who spend so much of the note, for those who spend so much time of their lives passing and repassing through this extraordinarily viscous spatio-temporal zone, that as the latter puts it, and this is Etienne, it is almost a home in which to live a life, which is awaiting to live a non-life, unquote. These designations and demarcations of what is at home and who can be are colloquial and familiar, but they have a history that is colonial through and through. The entire French military security apparatus, conceived in the 1950s, but also much earlier, to control an inferiorized internal population, as Mathieu Rigoste argues, has now been imposed on an interiorized immigrant population, most of whom are not immigrants at all, but French citizens. But the colonial figure of the undesirable element, as the Dutch call them, and the internal enemy, as the French did, has a much longer history. This we know. What we seem to know less about, in conclusion, are the ruinous qualities of life that these interior frontiers foster. While altered in density, composition, and form, they are spaces of refracted ruination, the dark infrared corridors on which divisions rely. And let us now praise famous men. James Agee described impoverished white tenant families in the American South in the 1930s, for whom there was no possibility of a buffered self, in Charles Taylor's terms, persons slandered by a system that produced, in Agee's words, slendering degrees of freedom over the course of their lives. We might consider whether such slendering degrees of freedom in our hyper-commodified world that celebrates fictive choice may manifest in the negative spaces of interior frontiers, of those who experience the obscene inequalities in which we live, as providing fewer buffers and no buffered self. Interior frontiers puncture possibilities by assuring that the unheimlich, the strange, the stranger, the not familiar, the too familiar, is an assault or potential assault on feeling at home, and that no matter where one falls in the space, and this is really important for me because it's not only those victimized by it, there is no safety or security. It's buttressed by a vicious fantasy that freedom comes from stronger barricades rather than the embrace of what Hegelians would call a radical dependency of us all. Thank you.
Okay, I want to begin, first of all, by thanking Adi Ophir for his gracious hospitality in gathering us here to honor Etienne Balibar's thought and to think along with him. And I also must say that I feel grateful for this morning's games, language or otherwise, because I'm making a little bit of a transgression here in terms of our rules by using an announced concept to do a little concept hopping, or concept surfing is how Emily put it earlier. So, in selecting the concept border as an avenue through which to approach Balibar's thought, I most certainly had in mind, for this cannot be avoided, his extensive work on the matter of geopolitical borders as such. Much of this work was animated by Balibar's incisive meditation on the problem of Europe, which ranges from the more historical and historiographical demands to account for the trajectory of European thought and its implications, to the political and cultural demands of the present as it unfolds, often quite unpredictably, in the real time of thinking and acting. To the first belongs a huge corpus that addresses almost the entirety of modern European thought, from the early work on Marx and Spinoza onward, and to the latter, the work that encounters key landmarks of European reality, from those texts on capital, class, nation, and race, to their eventual implication with questions of universality, secularity, citizenship, anthropology, and subjectivity. In a more pointed sense, this meditation on the concept of border in this European trajectory spans the range from the early analysis of the interior frontier in Fichte, of which Anne spoke to us with such eloquence, to the multiple interventions regarding the institutional project of the European Union in its various manifestations and names in the last 35 years. This much, as I said, is an unavoidable impetus. Yet, in addition, what has always struck me about Balibar's thought, but had not found an opportunity to come to the forefront for consideration until now, is that the border, as a very real, that is to say, historically actual formation, and not merely as a figure, resides at the heart of his thinking throughout. I will take the risk in Etienne's presence to claim that his thought relies largely on the border concept, on the capacity of ambiguous and self-contesting concepts to work their way through the barriers of established narratives and categorizations and pierce the cracks in those formidable forces of both conceptuality and periodization, that is, both the philosophical and the historical parameters of established logics that oftentimes, without our understanding, encumber our thinking even when we think against them. Once this thought occurred to me, a whole terrain opened up before me, and suddenly I was reading Balibar, who I've been reading for nearly 40 years, in an entirely different way. I discovered that what is elemental in Balibar's mode of thinking is a kind of double methodological path. Double in the sense that it involves two different modalities, which are, however, codeterminant and intersecting or intertwined, rather than just dialectical, parallel, or simply antithetical. Both these modalities have to do with what was signaled as necessary from the earliest years, the practice of reading, and indeed reading again in a double way. One, rigorously textual, even if the text is not literary. I cannot emphasize enough how eye-opening for me it was to see one of the greatest idea books of all time, Marx's Capital, be subjected to textual interrogation in the manner that literary critics devote to a difficult poem. The second mode of reading, rigorously historical, at times even genealogical, but this too is achieved by being rigorously attentive to language, to words themselves, or names, whether these may be subject, or Europe, or universality, or monotheism. I have to mention this because there is an unfortunately neglected gem of a text that Etienne has written on the history of the notion of monotheism, which is published in the French journal Critique.
It would be included in the American expanded
Of the secular,
version of
Okay.
the secularism.
Great, it's a fabulous text. So, so for Balibar, reading is really not the manifestation of the experience of one ideal reader, but the work of readership, and I emphasize work, which can only be done through the antagonistic conversation of a multiplicity of experiences of reading focused on a shared object. Hence the continuous dialogue and conversation is having with many of us over the years. So let me put on the table some of those key notions, which I'm calling border concepts. No doubt the most obvious one would have to be equilibrium. As the very name, but indeed the very act of radical naming we call neologism, signifies the entwinement of two powerful established concepts whose common historical trajectory has taken place in the mire of their undeconstructible mutual contestation. But I can say this equally of the term citizen subject, which has become under Balibar's signature a name, a composite name, that very much like equilibrium, to which it is obviously connected, enacts a deconstruction of both its components, while at the same time emancipating each component from the hegemonic logic that safeguards its power through time. To these two names, I could add others, say ambiguous universality, anti-violence, although no doubt more can be found. Whether single words or not, these names exemplify border conceptuality as method. It's possible, one can argue, that this border conceptuality is a particular expression of the dialectical method. However, if that were the case at all, and I think it is, but I would not need to get hung up on it, I would suggest that we would be speaking of dialectics in the way that Walter Benjamin understood the dialectical image. For what takes place is not a process of sublation, especially not in the direction of a concept's ascent to a more enhanced, even if altered, state, but rather the simultaneous deformation and transformation of a concept by its constitutive nature, whereby a concept is undone by its very properties, while at the same time enabling the reconstitution of these properties in altered form by this very undoing. Sometimes this is denoted in a verbal manner, as for example the often used phrase, secularizing the secular, which is borrowed from Bruce, or democratizing democracy. But it's important to underline here the simultaneity in the process by which a substantive or a concept is traversed by its property that enables an action of or transformation, which is why this is a peculiar dialectics. But we must remember that in Benjamin's terms, the dialectical image, or dialectics at a standstill, does not mean a disempowered dialectics. Rather, the dialectical image is a pulsing entity. The dialectics at a standstill is a pulsing condition. It is dynamic, even if it does not need the linearity of progressive time to enable dialectics to happen. Moreover, I would add the reminder that the use of the word border itself bears upon more than simply matters of location. A border is always a historical institution bearing a certain geotemporality, even when it is made to do the philosophical work of limit. Limits, or thresholds, we all know, are constitutively ambiguous, serving at the very least as portals, alternately open or barred, depending on a whole array of factors, conjunctures, Etienne often calls it, that can never be reduced purely to philosophical categories or to historical conditions. Useful here, I think, is also Derrida's inordinately enabling configuration of interdiction. Reading Kafka's parable Before the Law, Derrida reminds us that what is forbidding, l'interdit, is also the interstitial, l'interdit. What lies between the lines, often unsaid and unperceived, but always enabling the process of meaning even while serving as obstacle to meaning. Thus, in engaging with Balibar's conceptual method in this fashion, I bring together Sandro Mezzadra's figure of border as method with Amir Mufti's figure of partition as method, both being drawn, of course, from kindred political universes equally pertinent here, for in both cases, what is European cannot be articulated apart from what is colonial and vice versa. So to illustrate what I mean, I'm now going to start border surfing. I'm going to talk about equal liberty, citizen subject, and anti-violence, not about ambiguous universality. I regret this in retrospect because we've talked about equal liberty so much. Anyway, and then I will, because Etienne insisted that we think with him and think of our own terms, I will bring a term of mine in this context. That term is left governmentality. So, equal liberty, left governmentality.
Left. Right,
Yes, exactly. So, equal liberty. And I'm not obviously going to talk content as much as form, if that division can be made, okay? From the outset, Balibar reveals that in conjuring this word, he's displacing the use of the word democracy. And I would like to suggest that in this respect, he's restaging an original archaic displacement, though it would not have been consciously perceived as a displacement per se in the language of the ancients, which we see, for example, in Herodotus. Namely, that in place of democracy, as a specific mode of politics, let's say opposed to monarchy or oligarchy, the word Herodotus uses is isonomia, hardly a name that designates a political regime, but rather a societal condition. Equal liberty may be thought of as the modern name of isonomia. If we understand the work that Nomos is conducting in that ancient figure as the closest we can come to configuring the work that liberty is conducting in the post-Enlightenment conceptual sphere. For any notion of liberty in the ancient Greek political universe cannot be restricted to an existential condition, though this is, of course, where it begins, but achieves meaning in terms of how society is divided or apportioned, nemin, which is to say simply how society is organized. I want to suggest, in other words, that although political, the signification named by the word equal liberty bears directly upon the question of social organization, and indeed, to be precise, self-organization, autogestion. Equal liberty then derives from, but also accentuates further, the encounter of two paramount elements of the modern democratic imaginary, which are characterized by an irreducible and outmaneuverable struggle. The struggle emerges from and returns to the core of its condition, so that, from the isolated standpoint of each one versus the other, it might seem to be debilitating. At the absolute point, both these notions work at cross purposes, for the simple reason that absolute equality presupposes a fundamental constraint which liberty cannot contain, while conversely, absolute liberty shatters the regulatory regime, any regulatory regime, which thus makes equality impossible to achieve. Yet both are necessary conditions for radical democratic politics, which is why, given their constitutive antinomy, democracy enacts the aporia that makes it such precarious or high-risk politics, as we have been discovering recently, and not just in this country. This aporia permeates the project of the French Revolution, at least insofar as this project is announced in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, where a basic contradiction, to which the writers of the Declaration would have been impermeable, is presumed to be eradicated by the peculiar conjunction that couples the indefinite with a definite, the universal with a particular, and so on. Balibar takes this impossible equation as the departure point for a radical democratic politics that surely exceeds the historical parameters of its emergence, by literally merging the two terms and annihilating, one might say, their declared sacredness, which served, this is perfectly clear historically, as the transcendental guarantee of a new metaphysics of power. It makes sense to me in this respect that Balibar identifies equilibrium, and I quote here, as an absolute fiction, that's the word, or an institution with no foundation that is necessarily and irredeemably contingent. That is to say, a figure, fiction, much like I think the other quotation in Adi's paper yesterday, truth effect, that reminds me, brings to mind anyway, the way that Georges Sorel described the general strike as the quintessential myth of socialism. The result of this wordplay is a fluid conceptuality whose limits are internal. As is the way of the portmanteau, the concept opens at both ends and renders permeable the hard and external conceptual boundaries of each component, so that on the one hand, the whole equation is plunged into indeterminacy, and on the other hand, the evident merger is fissured, so that the conditions that are presumed to have been overcome, resolved, or sublated by the simultaneous pursuit of the two individual projects, liberty and equality, in their totalizing revolutionary pact, now take their place as inevitable mediations. As mediating conditions here, I would say, I'm thinking, among other things, sexual difference, incommensurable sociality, ambiguous universality, and perhaps, in fact, subjectivity as such. So I move very quickly, channel surfing, citizen-subject. I think one can argue that the concept citizen-subject is a sort of deconstruction of equilibrium, especially if we envisage equilibrium to have an interior frontier. From another standpoint, one could argue that citizen-subject is another phase of equilibrium, or perhaps even a phase, so long as we don't understand either phase or phase as a matter of sequence or of consequence. I'm not making a silly pun. Phase and phase are related at the root as epitomes of the troping power of image. Both equilibrium and citizen-subject belong to the same imaginary, and not only because of their shared historical content, but also in Etienne's hands because of their form, their borderline conceptuality. Like equilibrium, citizen-subject too involves an inveterate wordplay, as the word subject in a number of Latin-derived or Latin-affected languages is caught in the interplay between the metaphysics of grammar, the subject of a verb or sentence, subjectum, which becomes the subject of an action, and the metaphysics of sovereignty, the subject to power, subjectus, that is to say, the object whose action is authorized by some regime of subjection, which would include a self-making dimension, I would add, where subjection and subjectivation meet, as Foucault, Butler, and a range of other thinkers have elaborated. This constitutive perplexity of the subject is not alleviated by the coupling with the word citizen. To the contrary, Etienne uses it to complicate the presumed cognitive sovereignty of the term citizen, precisely in the way that history itself does, especially in its revolutionary moments. But the border concept figure performs an action that exceeds the historical mark, even the revolutionary one. It brings the problem of citizenship within the contentious realm that characterizes the question of political anthropology since the time, I would argue, of Aristotle's equally problematizing figure of the political animal. It's difficult to imagine how Aristotle could have come to the term zone politique without the historical actualization of democracy. Let's see. I'm skipping something here. This palpable, I would say that the revolution of the political in Athenian democracy creates a revolution of the natural. This palpable and fully actualized political mode of living being, zone, leans on the very processes of subjectification, configuring the sort of subjectivity whose nature is interrogative and transgressive, while being at the same time collaborative and collective against previous structures of communal hierarchy. The analogy in contemporary terms would be what Balibar configures to be the becoming citizen of the subject, which is always co-determined in palindrome fashion, as it were, with the becoming subject of the citizen. I'm taking the risk to suggest, within the question of political anthropology, Balibar's reconfiguration of the historical trajectory of the subjectum-subjectus relation, that the historical trajectory of the subjectum-subjectus relation might be a symptomatic reading of Aristotle's notion as well, even if Aristotle is not the object of reading, and rightfully so. The problem here is European sovereignty, which is, I would argue, a Latin and indeed a Christian trajectory. But insofar as the word citizen finds a semantic antecedent in the Greek conception of politis, the person of the polis, just as well simply political person, then the connection is there. What is less obvious is the connection, but I would argue they're still there, the connection in the relation between the animal and the subject, for the subject is already to a large extent a political term as subjectus, the person who is subjected to the authority of the sovereign, and in that respect may not even be quite a person, but either way represses the essential animality that cannot be abolished by the action of becoming a citizen. So I'm going to skip a bit here. Okay, insofar as the citizen enables a subjectification beyond the condition of subjection, then we can say that the animus, the natural substance in the phrase zoon politikon, the animal, yes, is qualified by the political, by becoming citizen. I mean qualified in the strongest possible sense of bearing qualities, which has nothing to do with being civilized or humanized or anything of that kind. The other side, however, remains to haunt the process, the becoming subject of the citizen. Here, the detour would have to go through Spinoza, which would link Aristotle to the modern history of democracy by continuing what I would argue to be a de-Christianized notion of politics and sovereignty. In reading backwards through Balibar's admirable encounter with Spinoza, I was struck by various elements that are useful here and tend to echo and elucidate Aristotle, even though they come from entirely different historical contexts. I quote Balibar here in a couple of instances, which I won't have time to elaborate. Just quotation. First, even before sovereignty can be defined as the sovereignty of the people, a people already exists, irreducible to the multitude of plebeians or a passive mob. Second quotation, we cannot claim that men are sociable in their origins, but they are always already socialized. The condition of always already, which is surely not reducible to a simple a priori, remains the deconstructive element in the otherwise dialectical dynamic of how the becoming citizen of the subject engages with the becoming subject of the citizen. Okay. Anti-violence. Of all the border concepts I mentioned here, anti-violence is the most curious or the least evident. This is because words bearing the prefix anti are conventionally made to bear a position of some solidity, which is rarely considered to be emancipated from its binding mirror condition. And yet, this is precisely the point of this brilliant formulation. Etienne tells us from the outset that anti-violence is not at all non-violence or counter-violence, these two being the quintessential negations that seal the conceptual sovereignty of violence. Strangely, unlike non-violence, which means literally a negation of violence, anti-violence signifies an antithesis that is fully implicated in the thesis that nominally gives it meaning, which is to say that it recognizes the dangerous delusion of seeing violence as an existential appendage that politics allegedly can overcome, which is the cornerstone of the Western metaphysics of sovereignty. Instead, Balibar sets as a task the impetus to think not of how politics can eradicate violence, as if a social imaginary can ultimately be reducible to its institutions, but of how violence is permeated by politics, making thus the question of politics immanent and crucial in any consideration of violence. And I should add here, in light of our discussion yesterday about the question of politics, that the question is always which politics, because this is where the political intersects with politics. I might kind of be really kind of outrageous by saying that the political here is the citizen subject of politics. It's fashion. Okay, so in simple terms, anti-violence is a concept that pertains foremost to politics, not to ethics or metaphysics, and it surely does not signify or even aspire to an overcoming of violence, but it does signify a way of imagining an emancipatory politics where violence is neither the subject nor the object that authorizes politics, but, and I quote here, the irreducible remainder over the institutional, legal, or strategic forms for reducing and eliminating it here, violence. This politics, which Etienne names, I quote again, the emancipatory insurgency that simultaneously perpetuates and eclipses the Constitution. I want us to think about this phrase. Notice the parallel structure here of of excess between violence as a remainder and the politics of insurgency. So this politics may be characterized by a sort of know thyself recognition that enables the self-constitution of a collective political subject, and I quote, in a world in which the political community no longer has natural or traditional basis, but can arise only from collective decision and practice. Such politics cannot possibly be restricted to the politics of autochthonous citizenship, whether ancient or modern, and in this respect cannot be reduced to any sort of transcendental rights that somehow precede its institution in the name of the citizen subject. It is profoundly historical in the sense of geotemporal, and in this respect, as precarious as any radical democratic politics is by definition, a politics of citizenship in which anti-violence would be endemic as a condition of internal otherness at the core of its constitution, but even more, or precisely as a consequence of a politics of, and I quote, citizenship permanently in the making. So that's Etienne's phrase. It makes perfect sense to me that Balibar will go on then to recognize this politics as a tragic politics. And this resonates with various arguments I've made to this effect. In a brilliant moment, near the end of Violence and Civility, he sees the politics of anti-violence as a borderline condition that he names Luxembourg's aporia. Elaborating further as the question, I quote, how can the balance between the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility be democratically shared? In this aporetic encounter, neither of these contrary ethical realms have any significance outside their political immersion in this paradoxical condition of democratic sharing, the proposition of equal liberty par excellence. Because no constitutional order of rights can possibly safeguard what actually takes place in the precarious arena of contested collective practice, this sharing cannot possibly be restricted to a priori authorization. All ethical positions are tragic. They're groundless, without guarantees, and meaningless in a literal, not pejorative sense, in themselves outside of the field of contention. Note that this tragic politics, Balibar says, is not heroic, and I have argued the same as well. It is a matter of tragic life, in other words, of the limit point of political anthropology. And now I come to a left governmentality in these terms. This concept I've named left governmentality is a paradoxical concept par excellence if we keep in mind the problematic relation of the left, at least in the Marxist, but also we could add the anarchist tradition, to the politics of government, as opposed to the politics of resistance, which is always instantaneously privileged. The problem emerges from the historical record of the left's incapacity to govern without being absorbed by the institution against which it stands, even when it has assumed power by force and by the violent dismantling of the Ancien regime, although this particular historical legacy actually does not concern me here. I'm proposing this notion not in the frame of the Leninist revolutionary left, but within the limits of a liberal parliamentary system, or more precisely, within the democratic process, whereby the left coming to the position of government does not abolish the democratic process. Any such action, regardless where it comes from, obviously is fascist. Which means right away that any sort of left governmentality will have to account for the possibility that it might be overthrown in the same way that it came to be. Hence, it is a regime of struggle. The paradox is aggravated further if we consider how Foucault's notion of governmentality tends to be interpreted as a mechanism for population control. Although there's great evidence in Foucault's thinking that would make governmentality a notion essential to a kind of autonomous, self-empowering politics. I'm thinking especially of Foucault's extensive work on the discipline involved in what he named the government of the self, for there's no doubt that any sort of left governmentality worthy of its name cannot possibly be excised from the self-governance of the subject, however we might agree or disagree about what this might involve and how feasible this might be. Indeed, self-government, an old autonomist adage, which is pertinent to the politics of society, has a mirror in the government of the self, with its extensive self-disciplinary practices that Foucault, we know, sought out in the Stoic period. So if governmentality in Foucault's writing is the figure that moves out of the disciplinary or punitive society model and into, say, the biopolitical or micro-power model, left governmentality is a figure that moves out of the counter-power model and turns the notion on its head, that is, so that societies of control become societies of self-governance. Left governmentality is as much a condition of governing the self as is the condition of governing the other, and of course by the self and by the other. In both cases, departing from both liberal individualist and Marxist collectivist modes where there remains a sharp division between self and other. Now, I invented this term initially without much thinking, I must admit, in response to the 2011-12 conjuncture that brought forth what we summarily now call politics of assembly movements, obviously Arab Spring, Greek-Spanish occupation of squares, the Occupy movement, subsequently things that happened in Istanbul and Hong Kong and so on and so forth. Even though, in retrospect, I would say that movement might be an inaccurate term of description because the operative politics involved in all those cases is in fact a kind of Benjaminian politics of arrest, of interruption. Subsequently, this idea found more concrete and higher stakes historical content in the rise of Syriza to power in Greek politics, especially since this signaled the rather unprecedented event of the left coming to power not by revolution, but by the procedures of a liberal parliamentary system. The key question in left governmentality is obviously how to move from resistance opposition to government decision. I don't see this as merely a positional shift in the spectrum of power, but rather something that requires the operations of a different political imaginary and a different framework of social organization. Left governmentality is a border concept because it acknowledges, it names the paradox of a political constituency that derives its authority from negation, resistance to established authority and at the outer limit revolution, having achieved the position of affirmation, the imperative to rule, especially if we understand the rule in a radical democratic sense, not to be reducible to ideological partisanship. For this latter reason alone, left governmentality entails the sort of rule that pertains to all and is shared by all of society, not just the extension of the specific class interests presumed to authorize leftist propositions of rule. Indeed, from my perspective, left governmentality has no meaning outside the problematic of democracy. And indeed, in our terms here, the paradoxical politics of equal liberty and the citizen subject. In this particular sense, the class politics that the Marxist legacy of the left has indelibly established, and in fact, the class struggle itself as a kind of epistemological framework in politics that permeates all levels of political thought and action, cannot be presumed to work against the radical democratic imperative that anarchist, as it is in its literal terms, you presume you know my argument with this, aspires to an autonomous politics at all levels of life and for all involved, regardless of the social differences that might still be in play. On the contrary, in this encounter of left governmentality with democracy, the epistemology of class struggle becomes a productive obstacle to the tendency to sublate social difference under the name of emancipatory universality. It underlines the ambiguous universality that the proposition of equal liberty necessitates. Now, time that will not allow me to go into the complex details of what left governmentality might entail in actual political practice. I've written about this elsewhere. In any case, my purpose here, as I said, is to measure this concept in light of Etienne's border conceptuality. But even in this context alone, to come to the end, the governmental politics that left governmentality enacts cannot obviously be restricted to typical institutional politics. The left in power, when it comes to govern the society as a whole with the inheritance of the capitalist state, cannot sever itself from the social movements that bring it to power in the first place. By social movements, I'm referring simply to politics of, I'm not referring simply to politics of negation or resistance, but more to radical affirmation politics. Solidarity networks, to come back to Gary's discussion yesterday, alternative modes of social organization at the local or international level, collective self-instituted public services, neighborhood health care, schooling for immigrants, welfare for impoverished strata, extra-parliamentary politics, and all kinds of performativities of difference. So in light of the notorious case of the Syriza government calling for a referendum in July 2015, I argued that the referendum was decided by the government and was won for the government by the movement in order for the government to act on this basis. Nothing in this equation should be assumed to be linear or self-evident or even simply causal. The components are irreducibly linked but cannot be collapsed into each other. Neither the government nor the movement is subservient to each other, and yet both the government and the movement are responsible for each other. They can exist just as easily in coincidence as in contestation, and indeed they must if the radical democratic impetus is to be sustained. Without the movement, there cannot be left governmentality. In other words, though left governmentality begins with and a sufficient cause in the fact that the left is in government, it cannot be solely conducted at the level of government. It cannot be exhausted within the purview of political institutions of government, but must involve general social practices of governance, indeed self-governance. So my last paragraph, for this reason, obviously, left governmentality cannot revert to simple party politics in the liberal system. In fact, its perpetually contentious relation between governance and insurgency, government and movement, is precisely why left governmentality is a border concept that bears a tragic politics. The non-revolutionary left's notorious resistance to taking on the responsibility of government in its name might be due to its fear of losing its authenticity of resistance or counterpower, which is curiously never the fear of revolutionaries, despite the fact that historically this seems to have happened every time, or how could it not? Yet, as Balibar incisively reminds us, and in fact he lays this reminder in the context of tragic politics specifically, and I quote, "The risk that the revolt might be perverted is never sufficient reason not to revolt." Permit me to add, especially in the conjuncture of the present time, that the bloody tragedy of left politics today is certainly never sufficient reason to think that left politics now lies dead on the stage. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes for questions, and please we will try to sort of burst the interior frontier that this table represents. So if you have questions across the room, I'll try to keep note of those as well. Yeah, Adi?
So I have a question or a remark maybe about your beautiful construction of the work of the concept in the work of Etienne. What you describe as border concept in Etienne work, it always seemed to me as a very specific model of constellation. So in all your border concepts are actually double concepts. The one you spoke about, civility and violence, subject, citizen, equality, liberty. So not all of them, it's not always a doublet, but there are many doublets. the doublets are always at the center of something, and there are some satellites. So in the case of equilibrity, for example, you have property and community, individuality, etc. So what we have is always a very careful, reconstructed configuration, and always, often, maybe not always, I don't want to sound exhaustive, but it often, so there is this configuration, and then there is a parallel movement or a parallel argument that shows how the configuration was transformed at a certain point, at a kind of an event that transformed the configuration, and a new configuration arises.
Yeah, of course, I agree. I mean, basically, I mean, you notice that I didn't use violence and civility. I used anti-violence on purpose to break up that thing, and I actually said this in the subject, though it's actually a name. But of course that's true, and then ambiguous universality clearly is too. But the point here is that, yes, borders, any notion, the border figure, always is engaged in some sort of constellation. That's just sort of, for me, definitional. I mean, because it is a kind of threshold notion. It literally is like a trap door, because it opens, closes, and therefore. But I would not say that the constellation may change as a result. But this doesn't mean that there is, in that sense, any kind of Aufhebung. The thing about these concepts that's remarkable is that they remain thresholds in all the constellations, in the new constellations. So it's not so that. But I agree, of course. I mean, in essence, yes.
And interior frontier, of course.
Of course.
There is no language that I know that I can read or speak, excuse me, or even write. There are not many, of course, 4 or 5, plus the ancient. No, but there are many lacking. There are no non-European languages. That's my. Okay, where where you don't have a plurality of names or terms for this thing, the border, the boundary, the frontier, the limit, and so on. And as soon as you need to shift from one language to another, even very close, for example, confini in Italian, you realize that the border, the boundaries, why is boundary 2 called boundary 2? The Journal of Art. Okay, leave that. So you immediately realize that the limit or the difference or the threshold between the various names is typically untranslatable. I mean, it's never the same. So reversals, displacements, etc. So that could be just banal semantic fact, but you may also want to use it as a symptom for the kind of problems we are trying to deal here with. And I want to be infinite. I will mention only 3 of them, develop. I mean, of course, I progressively became almost obsessed with, and I believe the extraordinary papers we just heard added not to that, they clarified in respects, but so the first one is, and speaking to a Greek citizen or after a Greek citizen, I hope this resonates. It is the circle between the question of definition and the question of border that makes definition defining a border an impossible task, just as conceptualizing the concept and so on, because the very notion of border or limit is already involved in the idea of definition. In Greek, oros, orizein. So the second, and that's of course a dimension. If definition is something crucial for conceptualization, which I believe everybody will admit very simply, and if the question whether there is or there is no concept of religion is to be addressed in a manner that is not just a paralogism. I mean, why? This is one possible way indicating that there are always explicit or latent political conditions of possibility for any conceptualization. Second and more rapidly, border lines. Incidentally, Anne Green, thank you for elaborating on my references to Green. But the concept of borderline is a technical psychiatric concept, borderline states. And in fact, it soon becomes borderline people. And so borderlines, and that's to address the issue of political dimensions, are by definition both local and global. I mean, they are the main instrument to locate territories and, as a consequence, populations within the Earth, as Patrice would say, I mean, the global space. And that works both ways, of course. It infects the global with local characteristics, and it inserts global stakes, nomos of the Earth, if you like, into any even very tiny, small local border. And of course, in these days, when we talk about suburbs, banlieue, or cities, that becomes absolutely clear. And of course, colonization is the archetypical, but perhaps not the only modality of regulating that reciprocity in modern history, and perhaps even before, as Charles Mills suggested yesterday. And third, that's the most speculative mention. I don't know if Patrice will accept to consider it materialist. I'm not really sure. But the absolute ambiguity or equivocity of the name interior in our Western, let's say, essentially Latin tradition. Also, I mean, not only lies at the heart of the political, philosophical dilemma or couple, with on one side, in France, for example, something called the Ministre de l'Intérieur, the Minister of the Interior, which here would be the Homeland Security, plus a number of other responsibilities. And what we are seeing in France at this moment is increasing, somebody was mentioning that to me yesterday, an increasing number of political and administrative questions being now put under the authority of the Ministre de l'Intérieur. They become interiorized in that sense. And of course, on the other side, that was Bernard, I believe, yeah. And on the other side, of course, you have the very core of our theological, political, philosophical tradition. That is Augustine's formula, interior intimo meo. Where the sovereignty and the subjectivity essentially lies is something that is more interior than the interior itself. Now, Kant had a word for that. He is, I believe, the one who touched the question in a specific passage of the Critique of Pure Reason that several readers of Kant, including myself, if I may, although I never wrote on that, consider to be the very heart, the secret core of the critique, called the Amphibolie des Reflexionsbegriffe, the amphibology of the concepts of reflection. And I increasingly, concept of reflexive concept, and I increasingly believe that this is the alpha and omega of every philosophical speculation.
Okay, so I have Michelle, Bernard, Jacques, but did you want to comment on this point in particular?
No.
It's to do with the reflection, but I can wait.
Oh.
Yeah.
Somebody get him a mic.
So this is a question for Stathis, and it's to do with how you understand. Thank you for a wonderful and very generative for me paper, by the way. It's a question to do with how you understand the tension between social movements and government. And so at a certain moment in your talk, the opposition between negation and affirmation, which would be one way of understanding that tension, breaks down. And the tension between resistance and governance also becomes problematic because of the gesture of autonomous self-governance, which is characteristic of so many global movements, particularly today. And so the question for me becomes whether this is the place for what I would call the politics of judgment. The tension between class struggle and equal liberty, as you have described it, could, I think, be fairly understood as a tension between a cognitive and a reflective approach to social space. So my question essentially is whether that distinction, which one could draw back to the debate between Hegel and the Romantics on the relationship between politics and aesthetics, isn't important for understanding the concrete differences between movements and governments, or between movement and government more abstractly, and for thinking about what it would mean to establish a form of left governmentality that could in some way bridge the space between the two, if that's, as I took it to be, a part of your sort of project.
Wow, yeah, thank you, actually. Great question. I think the simple answer is yes. Yes, of course. Although I will have to, you notice that my argument was narrowly constructed within the, let's say, cognitive parameters of the history of the Marxist left. But I am definitely willing to think outside of that as well. It gets a little, I'm not sure whether the argument can extend in that other sphere seamlessly, because where then we can bring in Hegel, the Romantics, in the way that you suggest, which intuitively I would say yes. I mean, it makes sense to me. But I don't know if we can move it seamlessly, because there is something about the history of the Marxist left and its relationship to governance, including governance of itself, that is tragic. It just is. And that is really, that is something that we have to really think about very seriously. And so, and it may also be the case, I'm not sure, but it may also be the case that only in that context of the Marxist left, and okay, Marxist left is a very large thing here, okay, it's not a small thing, but nonetheless it has some boundaries, that kind of outside boundaries, that within that kind of the history of the Marxist left, that might be the only place where government and movement are always thought to be in opposition, but have to be thought not to be in opposition, which would not, however, abolish their opposition, because that's the key. You know, how do you sustain the two things simultaneously? And this was, of course, put to the test by the Greek case. It collapsed very quickly. It's very hard to sustain. I mean, it's not. Nonetheless, it was definitely put in place. It was something that was thought about. People acted on it. It wasn't just sort of, you know, history kind of moves forth and just makes it happen. So this suggests to me that it can, in fact, happen. There could be other cases. If one looks at the history of anarchist rule in Catalonia for a period, one sees that too. It's a very short period, but one sees it there.
The Italian cases, I think, very
The Italian anarchist cases, yeah.
No, I'm talking about the communist left. In other words, the 70s that fails to take government.
Yes.
Or when it does take government, it loses the movement, and now, an idea of movement and insurgency in people like Negri that cannot account for governmentality.
Right. I mean, remember that they thought at the time that Eurocommunism was actually, in that sense, a sellout because it embraced party politics.
Exactly.
While Syriza never quite did that, at least as at the discourse level. I think by now we may say that's the case. Big discussion. But the point there was that no, we're not going to be just another party. We're a troublemaking. It's a troublemaking kind of organism, as I called it.
Okay, so I think maybe we can take about another 10 minutes or so. Is that all right, Adi? Okay, so maybe we should take 2 questions at a time. Is that so? Maybe Michelle and then Bernard, and then I see Susan as well.
I have a question. Does it work?
Yes.
I have a question for both of you, but maybe I try to be limited in my time. So for Stathis, my question is this. It seems to me that left government...
Closer.
Okay?
Yeah.
Yes? That left governmentality, I know you like the apparatic, is not as apparatic as one would think, or at least not even as paradoxical as one would think, if we stick to a Foucauldian approach. And when I say Foucauldian approach, I mean a Foucauldian approach that is carefully de-Agambenized. Meaning by that the difference between governmentality and sovereignty is kept, at least at the methodological level. Because if governmentality is seen from a Foucauldian way, well then it is in a way, I would say it's synonymous to civility, but it operates in the same way, because what is governmentality? It's a kind of power that is about trying to act on the action of the other, to modify their conduct. And that is something that is happening even in the most anarchist organization. There was a governmentality of Zuccotti Park. There was a governmentality of Puerta del Sol. So therefore, when governmentality becomes crystallized in government is another issue, but the fact that there is a governmentality of the left, and many governmentality of the left. However, and that's the last point, I don't know if you know, you probably do know, there is this spectral point that Foucault made sentence that he made that was never found anywhere. I mean, Daniel Defer talks about it, but it's impossible to find anywhere, where he said that the problem with the socialists, it was in the early 80s when the socialists just won power, is that they have a theory of the state and of sovereignty, but they have no theory of governmentality and of government.
It's in the birth of it.
I don't think I look and look and look. It's not. Okay.
There's no socialist government.
All right. That's
But anyway,
you should.
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but that's so. Even though there is, or there should be, a left governmentality, clearly what his complaint was that the onus on the state and the onus on sovereignty was such that governmentality per se was never very much developed on the left.
So, Bernard, would you want to follow up?
Yeah, I'll follow up because it goes to Anne, but both also, and it picks up a little bit on governmentality, or it could. In your marvelous paper, in the language, I heard a lot of eroticization and sexualization and sexual violence and sexual assaulting around the notion of internal frontiers. And of course, it made me immediately think of Blanchot and Foucault and les expériences limites, etc. But it was distinctive. I mean, it was there. Well, there was a lot about permeabilities and penetrations, etc. in the language you were using. So I thought that was. I'm surprised that you're finding that you're surprised, because and the question was going to be. was that metaphor, was that parallel, was that the model of the kind of equivocal potentialities of the internal frontiers? And so, and more specifically, how would we think about that more generally to the larger, of course it is political, but to the other political domains, and whether we should be thinking of it as the model?
That's great. Thank you. Don't you have to answer?
Go ahead. No, I've spoken already.
Yeah, my subliminal. I guess it's very hard for me to think of transgression without seeing it as bodily as well. I'm not, but I think what you're getting at is something about desire and aversion, right? That is in that space, and Etienne doesn't go there in his thinking actually with the interior frontier. He does it's opening and blockage, right? You go there, but not to this very physicality of it, and the permeability of one's boundary to oneself, or what one imagines oneself is. I'm a little nervous and thinking I would reduce it, given what I've just been writing about bodily exposures that exceed sexualities, that are not, I don't want to reduce to sexuality, that I want to look at all kinds of touchings, movement across. But it's interesting that you should pick that out of it in this way. I was trying to get at something else. I'm nervous, worried about, and it sounds strange, that so much of our focus is on what we could possibly do and not on actually what some of the lay of the land is among those for whom we're not sympathetic. And I was trying to get at something about the way in which this space of interior frontiers permeates people's sense of self in ways that Etienne opens to a kind of subjective violence that I feel sometimes we're skipping past the graveyard on how invested people are in some of this racial logic. It's not even a logic for them. It is embodied. It is embraced. And I want to know how tactile it is. I think more...
How?
Tactile.
Tactile.
How sensory.
Yeah, yeah.
How and embodied is, we've gotten, that word has become kind of emptied of meaning. So I'm trying to look for in a vocabulary that gets at something else about how it's felt. And I don't mean sentiment sitting up here, you know, in affect theory, the way you were kind of alluding to it yesterday, Gary. But I mean affect as actually how you are, your entire being is affected. And that it need not be verbal at all. No, not talking about the verbal. So that was what I was trying to keep turning on, that it's not just like imposed by the state, it's not just imposed by the institutions, it's actually the investments that coalesce with that congeal with it, that make me really uncomfortable. So thank you for that. I have to think more about it.
So I'm getting signals that we should break for lunch.